Muito bem, então agora nós vamos já partir para mais uma atividade nesse nosso encontro, que é o fireside chat, a perspectiva dos Estados Unidos sobre a relação bilateral. O diálogo vai abordar a posição dos Estados Unidos diante da relação com o Brasil, analisando os desafios e as oportunidades que se apresentam neste novo contexto político e econômico da administração americana. Então, aqui já conosco, para tratar sobre esse assunto, temos, como já foi dito, mencionado, o embaixador Thomas Shannon Jr. e também o vice-presidente executivo das American Society Council of the Americas, Brian Winter.
Bom, boa tarde a todos novamente. Ministro Mauro Vieira, quero cumprimentá-lo. Eu sei do esforço que foi preciso para estar com a gente aqui hoje, então muito obrigado mais uma vez ao senhor e ao seu time por prestigiar esse evento com a sua presença aqui. O Conselho das Américas e a Fiesp, em parceria, nos tempos bons e os tempos mais desafiadores da relação bilateral, sempre vamos estar aqui no Brasil, sempre temos esse compromisso com a relação bilateral. Então, muito obrigado. O meu amigo Josué, quando disse no começo do evento que eu falo um português perfeito, ele estava exagerado. Eu falo mesmo, dizem muitos amigos que falo com sotaque do interior de Sao Paulo. Então, em parte por esse motivo, essa parte do nosso evento vai ser em inglês, dessa conversa aqui com o embaixador Thomas Shannon. Tom, Ambassador, thank you so much for being here with us today. You also traveled from far, and the logistics were not easy, so thank you. Our first conversation about Brazil and the United States was actually almost exactly 20 years ago. It was in the cafeteria of the State Department. You were serving at the time as the Assistant Secretary of Western Hemisphere Affairs. I was in my previous life as a young journalist. I had just written a book about Brazil. And over the years, we've spoken a lot about this relationship. I'm sure you'd agree with the foreign minister that right now, if it's not the most challenging time, it's one of the most challenging times that we've seen in these 20 years and perhaps that we've seen in 201 years. And I think our objective today is to focus this conversation on the present and the future, and try to think of possible ways out, because I know that that's on the mind of everyone here. But I would like to ask you before, as a way to frame the conversation, how did we get here? When you think about how we got to this moment, what's the story that you tell?
Well, thank you very much, Brian, and Minister, thank you for your presence here today. It's an enormous pleasure to see you again and your superb team. Many memories of our work together in Brasilia and in Washington, among other places. So, well, what a pleasure. And it's a great pleasure to be here in this conference, to be with all of you, and the hospitality of Fiesp. And you, my dear friend, has been wonderful. And Brian, again, thank you. Brian has decided to start this with a very easy question, which is, how does this all begin? And I guess I would say this. What has happened recently is a profound shock to the system for all of us who have worked to build the U.S.-Brazil relationship over time. But I would say that in many ways, Brazil comes late to this moment. And what I mean by that is that during the first several months of the second Trump administration, Brazil was really not on the radar screen of President Trump. There were a few moments where interest flickered at the White House, either because of Brazil's growing relationship and importance within the BRICS community, or because of debate and dispute within Brazil over the content of social media and the degree to which this might limit freedom of expression. But for the most part, the Trump administration was focused elsewhere. And the Trump administration had shown that it was not adverse to interfering in the political affairs of other countries, sometimes with our most important partners and allies. At the very beginning of the Trump administration, the president's administration took Germany and France and the United Kingdom to task for what they considered to be efforts to limit the political development of right-wing political parties and to limit forms of political expression, especially on social media, supposedly designed to limit the reach of some of these right-wing parties. And in the instance of Israel and the criminal case against Prime Minister Netanyahu, the president had also made clear that he thought that the Israeli judiciary should step away from the case and allow the prime minister to govern. So in several instances, the administration had already showed a willingness to interfere in the institutional activities of democratic institutions, but also the political processes of democratic countries. What is striking about the case of Brazil in this instance, and especially the 50% tariffs levied against Brazil, is that it's really the first time the president uses tariffs for a political purpose. And this is both surprising, but also, as the minister noted, complicated, because this is not something that can be negotiated easily. And so I start this way simply to note the fact that Brazil pops up on the radar of the White House for political reasons, but especially related to the situation facing former President Jair Bolsonaro, which the president has chosen, President Trump has chosen, to understand as a reflection of his own experience within the United States in the aftermath of the 2020 elections, and his own willingness to interpret events in Brazil as a replay of sorts of what he himself went through. This is worth noting because the president is not a particularly ideological man. And in many ways, while he has been adept at reading the American body politic and adept at using power within American political institutions, he is a politician of a rare sort in the United States, and not one who necessarily wants to leave a political legacy so much as he wants to leave a social and economic legacy. But somewhere inside of him is a belief, again built on his own experience, that the great democracies that have developed around the world in the aftermath of World War II have also created entrenched and privileged bureaucracies and political parties and economic leaders who over time have sought to use their influence and power to prevent the emergence of alternative voices. And when he and his administration begin their attacks on Germany, on France, on the UK, and others, it's all with this belief that by doing so, they are attacking encrusted parties and institutions, which, if they could just be broken apart, would release new political energies and release a voice of a people that had in some way been repressed. And it's regrettable to note that in the case of his support for former President Bolsonaro, he obviously believes the same thing here. This is where the challenge that faces the Brazilian government, and especially the minister among others, becomes much more than diplomatic. It becomes of a sort political. Because what has to be done in short order is not just to organize private sectors, as important as that is, and not just to make the larger point that these tariffs are causing significant harm in the United States and significant harm to economic relationships that are going to be fundamental to our ability to conduct business not only in Brazil but throughout South America and beyond. But there also has to be a political component to this in which President Trump has shown that he's mistaken, that Brazil is a vibrant democracy, that it has a vibrant media, that it has a vibrant space in which debate takes place, and that within that vibrant space, the actions that the United States has taken are actually going to harm the people the president seeks to promote and complicate a political environment in ways that are not positive. And so I think the bottom line here is that Brazil is unique in the way in which tariffs have been used, but it's not unique in the way in which this administration has sought to bring pressure to bear on the democratic political systems of our closest partners. And that it presents to Brazil in this moment a significant challenge, but it's not an impossible challenge, given all that this society offers and, as the minister noted, the unbreakable bonds that exist between the civil societies, and especially the private sectors of our two countries. That was a long response to your question, but I'm sorry for that.
That was a good response. Well, let me ask you another easy question, but a direct one. It has been widely commented that President Trump may see this confrontation in very personal terms because of what he perceives as the parallels between his word, the persecution that he faced during his time outside the White House, and the criminal case currently facing ex-President Bolsonaro. My question for you is, as we think about the current possibilities for negotiations, whether they be this week or perhaps a month from now, Minister Vieira very clearly indicated that the Brazilian government is not closing the door to dialogue on the economic parts of this situation. My question for you, Ambassador, is do you believe that this story with the Bolsonaro family is in fact the central axis of this situation in the mind of President Trump? And if so, is there any kind of deal that might be possible?
Well, as I noted, I do believe that he views the situation facing former President Bolsonaro as very similar, if not the same, to what he faced. And therefore, he has great sympathy for the former president. And I believe that he has been told that somehow saving the president from the Supreme Tribunal and opening a new space for him politically would have a profound political impact internally in Brazil. But having said that, what's remarkable about President Trump is that he is open to evidence. He is open to political pressure, and he is open to the consequences or understanding the consequences of his action. This is what I meant when I said he was not ideological. He doesn't try to fit the world into his own thoughts. his thoughts respond to the world around him. And therefore, I do believe there is a space where Brazil can make clear that it is a democracy that has its own structure, its own sovereign, the Brazilian people, and that it will only respond to that sovereign and not an external sovereign, number one. And that this problem can be resolved by separating the political from the economic. As I mentioned before, I believe this is the first time the president has used tariffs for a political purpose. If he realizes that that's not going to work, he might be prepared to step away and try to separate the two in some fashion. And to a certain extent, the structure of that already exists. In the sense that, as offensive as it might be to Brazilians, the revocation of visas and the use of the Magnitsky Act against members of the Supreme Court have already indicated that in the eyes of the Trump administration, these justices are not to be dealt with by the United States. And so you separate that from the impact of the tariffs itself.
Well, and this was a path that has been suggested by some other actors, including briefly Senator Flavio Bolsonaro, who at one point sent a tweet that essentially suggested that it would be a gesture of grandeur by the Trump administration to drop the sanctions against Brazil and to treat the judicial matter with sanctions against individuals. And I know that I've heard in other quarters of Washington that may eventually be the path out of this. Let me ask you a question, maybe open the aperture on this to in a more global fashion. There have been other negotiations in Washington over the last 6 months plus that also seemed extremely difficult at the time. I would name the case of President Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, who, when President Trump took office, he was talking not just about an end to USMCA, but potentially about military action in sovereign Mexican territory. President Sheinbaum comes from the left. It was widely predicted that those two leaders would not be able to talk to each other, and those predictions were incorrect. There have been many conversations, and a fluid relationship has been established. President Zelensky of Ukraine was another case in point where at one point he was thrown out of the Oval Office. And yet in a short time later, the tone of that dialogue changed. Are there any lessons in this case, recognizing that the Brazilian case is unique because a judicial matter has been placed at the center of this question, but is there anything that we can learn about a possible way forward based on some of the global context, other things that have happened?
I believe so, and I think the different cases that you've described are important, if for no other reason to show that the president is malleable. As I mentioned, he responds to the world around him.
He listens.
Yeah. And so these things are never easy, because at the same time, he's not an individual who will publicly and easily stand down or admit that he's been mistaken in an approach. He'll just move on to the next set of issues. And I believe that in this case, Brazil is about as well positioned as it can be. It's not my job to give the Brazilian government advice, and I wouldn't pretend to do so compared, especially with someone of the extraordinary professional career of Minister Vieira. But Brazil has made its case clear. It has been prepared to engage with the United States around trade-related issues, both in Washington and in the WTO, and has opened the door to a resolution of this by doing so. And so it's just a question of getting the president to hear that and to understand it.
Minister Vieira, if at any point you have any comments you'd like to make, please.
Não, eu quero apenas agradecer os comentários do embaixador Shannon, que é um habilíssimo diplomata, se desempenhou maravilhosamente bem em todas as funções importantes que teve. Eu o conheci como secretário assistente no Western Hemisphere Affairs do Departamento de Estado, depois como embaixador no Brasil, e sempre demonstrou a mesma habilidade e o mesmo conhecimento. É muito bom ouvi-lo, porque ele conhece não só o Brasil, como também todo o continente americano, o hemisfério ocidental, como usado na nomenclatura do Departamento de Estado, e tem a capacidade de fazer comparações. Eu acho apenas que, como colocarei, que ao se ver num espelho, como o embaixador Shannon indicou, o presidente Trump teve também problemas e tem problemas judiciais, mas são de natureza totalmente diferente do ex-presidente Bolsonaro. Portanto, eu acho que não necessariamente podem ocorrer as mesmas consequências, os mesmos resultados após o término do seu governo, e eu creio que são questões totalmente diferentes. A natureza das acusações de grande gravidade no caso brasileiro. Como eu disse durante a minha apresentação, de nossa parte, estamos sempre prontos a conversar, e foi muito útil ouvir esses comentários seus e do embaixador Shannon. Isso pode sempre ajudar e pode nos orientar um pouco nos próximos passos, mas o importante é renovar que estamos sempre abertos a conversar, a discutir tudo que seja comercial e tarifário. Quanto a isso, não há dúvida, isso é a tradição do Brasil, é a tradição da diplomacia brasileira, que é a da discussão, da negociação. Os outros aspectos são inegociáveis, como eu também disse, e esperamos que possamos chegar a um bom porto, a uma boa solução. Espero que possam se abrir em breve canais outros de comunicação e de negociação que nos levem a uma solução adequada a todo esse momento que estamos vivendo. Era o que eu teria a acrescentar. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado, Ministro. Tom, I just have one more question. I know we have, I think, 5 minutes left before the Minister of Finance will join us. Given the very clear statements from Minister Vieira, we have a room full of people here representing businesses and organizations from Brazil, from the United States, and throughout Latin America who, in different ways, are all facing challenges because of the current situation. And my question is, what advice or what kind of orientation do you have for the people in this room as far as how they might be able to help work toward eventually some kind of new equilibrium between the two countries?
Well, in some ways, the minister has already indicated that pathway because he highlighted the way in which the Brazilian private sector and the American private sector engaged in the immediate aftermath of the imposition of the tariffs in order to, actually even before they were imposed, in order to win exceptions to the tariffs. And that in some ways that initial grouping of exceptions were kind of an X-ray into the U.S.-Brazil commercial and investment relationship, because it highlighted those areas that needed an exception because of the impact that the tariffs would have on the American consumer. But I believe that the private sectors of both countries need to find a way to move beyond exceptions to fundamentally change how the president and others understand the commercial relationship. You know, some time ago, I said that the U.S.-Brazil relationship would be one of the fundamental pieces of a 21st century global order. As we border on disorder, I still believe the U.S.-Brazil relationship is an important one, but it's not just important because of the history of engagement between our two governments, which has over 200 years of history behind it, but because of the way in which our societies have met each other and engaged over time, whether it be the private sector, whether it be universities and laboratories, whether it be faith-based communities, whether it be other aspects of our civil society. We are societies that, in an odd way, have met each other and, in the process, seen reflections of ourselves as the two great economies and the two great democracies of our hemisphere. And I believe it's important to find a way to underscore in Washington and elsewhere that the immediacy of these tariffs are not just about whether or not you can get a cup of coffee at Starbucks for the same price, or whether or not you can eat chicken McNuggets, or whether you can buy a hamburger at Burger King or a beer from Anheuser-Busch, or whether you can fly on a regional aircraft without touching Brazil in some way or having the experience made more costly because of tariffs. I think we need a vision towards the future, because this is a commercial and investment relationship that has grown at pretty remarkable speed and has been reciprocal in its benefits. But there's much more to come, especially as we look at the high end of our economy, the value-added end of our economy, and especially as we look at what the advances in high technology are going to bring to both of our societies, whether it be in the digital world, from cryptocurrency to artificial intelligence, whether it be in pharmaceuticals, whether it be in civil aviation and agriculture and beyond. And to break this partnership at this point in time, to undermine it at this point in time, would have significant consequences for us both, and put both of our countries on pathways to economic and social development that would not nearly be as helpful or as beneficial as they could be. And so I believe that the private sectors play an important role, not just in protecting the interests of the moment, but in articulating the interests of the future and what it is we can accomplish together.
Ambassador Shannon, Minister Vieira, Josue.
May I make one question?
Yeah, please.
Do you believe that the investigation under Section 301, which hearings will start next week, I think, could be a path forward to separate political and economic?
It could be. I mean, I think it was begun primarily or initially in order to ensure that the president had a trade-based rationale for his tariffs should the use of tariffs for a political purpose be declared invalid by a U.S. court. But at the same time, once you start talking about trade practices, well, then the other side gets to respond. And so you start a negotiation whether you intend to or not. And so I do think that it opens a pathway, should the Trump administration decide to look for a way to get out from under this conflict, that's one way to do it.
Minister Vieira, Josue, Ambassador Shannon, thank you so much.